In the past, there was stated to have been a time where darkness had completely engulfed the land. A time when the population attempted to survive by staying inside, away from the darkness and the demons that seemed to dwell within it. Was this actually a time, or was this merely some mythical account? A year of darkness. A solar eclipse that lasted for an entire year. It seems to defy the laws of celestial mechanics. And yet we have numerous myths, various accounts, legends that state that the only thing seen at night was a moon that was blood red, with no other stars in sight. Join me as we explore this account of this terrifying time. Solar eclipses are displayed and depicted in numerous works of art through the past. They seem to be very dramatic events, the sun being blotted out. Although from our understanding, the longest a solar eclipse lasts is merely a few minutes. And while it may be a dramatic event, it's certainly not an event that lasts. And yet we do have this concept of this profound emotional impact on an entire society and a civilization. It's recorded and memorized. We've also had the official record of the solar eclipses and when they're supposed to happen, going all the way back to Babylonian times. There's even accounts of terrifying gods and deities from older religious beliefs and legends that indicate that there was a time that the very land itself was afflicted by a horrific evil, or an enemy that preyed on the very people itself, which they were helpless to resist. Think of a time with an ancient civilization that faced a terrifying destruction. In this exploration, we're going to examine this entire account of the Year of the Black Sun, a time in which there was a solar eclipse, or perhaps an event that we can only describe as a solar eclipse. Maybe it was something else entirely. And how does it relate to this incredible basilica that still stands to this day in Dyersville, Iowa? There is one component of this story that we've looked at before, but it should be noted that there are other events and other accounts that we have of similar events. And much like with all the other questions that we have, is it possible that the when on these events, the time that they occurred, may have been lost to our understanding? That there's actually an entirely different timeline that currently eludes our understanding. That instead of these being different events that are separated by hundreds of years or decades, these are one event. Imagine a civilization that had reached astounding heights that we can't even begin to dream. Heights of not only technological achievements, but also achieving a true balance in society. A simple balance between the welfare of the individual and the needs of the entire society. Are there any remnants of this civilization that we still see to this day? You can certainly look around in varied parts of the land, to include Iran and various locations in the Middle East, where you'll see signs of incredible architecture and amazing construction, detailed with tremendous precision. There's also the mythical and legendary accounts that we have of some sort of terrifying evil force that swept across the land. Is this really such a myth as we like to think? Or is this actually documenting a historical event that really transpired? The fall of the civilization that preceded ours. Now, of course, official history says that there were numerous civilizations that preceded ours. Although if we're just going off of one particular region of the land, such as the aforementioned Western world, then we talk about the great civilization of Rome. Rome, which began as a kingdom, evolved into a republic, and then some would say de-evolved into an empire. But whatever form of government it had, it was a great civilization. Was there really a civilization of Rome, or did it represent something else? Is it merely a means to explain why we have these ruins that are quite similar across the land, and why we see them everywhere, and not just in Europe, but in places such as Asia to this day? What do these figures in these reliefs really represent? Is this some kind of mystical figure that's even beyond our understanding of who they might be in our true history? Many people would say that this represents a Messiah, a Savior, or could it represent someone else entirely? The continued accounts of the legacy of Gog and Magog, or the invasion of some sort of terrifying and horrific force, of evil or of an ancient enemy that completely overran the previous civilization. We've looked at it and explored it before, the accounts that there was a power that simply couldn't be stopped. But if we understand the civilization that preceded ours to be in better balance and have a better sense of unity, then what would it have taken to overcome that civilization? We understand and theorize that this ancient enemy approached and attacked from many different directions, both internally and externally. And we still see in reliefs in caves, such as Iran to this day, that seem to communicate this story. We even have older maps that record some sort of terrifying force that threatened the land. Now, was it in one simple geographic location, such as with the incredible gates of Alexander that are in the Caucasus regions to this day, that coincidentally may have been protecting one of the last enclaves of this previous civilization? Do we see examples of this story even in what we may consider myth or high fantasy, such as the account of the fall of Gondolin in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien? Is that really just some high fantasy story, or is that actually a story that's influenced, inspired by true events that occurred? We're not talking about our concepts of the classic warfare of the medieval time frame, or even the great sieges that occurred during the latter days of the Roman Empire. We're talking about a more advanced civilization that faced a much more insidious and destructive threat. And that seems to be the original account that we have from the civilization that preceded ours. It's not detailed directly in our current historical account, but bits and pieces of it are scattered in different geographical areas, given different origins, and then given different dates. And as a result of that, we really can't gain an understanding for what actually happened in the past. But if we step back and we put together the consistent pieces, where we have similar events, we can actually put together a series of events based on cause and effect that explain much more elaborately and much more precisely what happened, such as the concept of the leaders of this previous civilization being corrupted by some sort of strange, inexplicable internal force. Now, of course, we may explain this as a spiritual corruption where their behaviors changed completely. But is it possible that they were inhabited by some sort of parasite? As a result of the leadership of the previous civilization being compromised, it led to its complete and total destruction from an external threat from this ancient enemy or adversary that sought to completely destroy it. Now, how exactly did this great civilization contact this ancient adversary or enemy? We have many different theories. Could it have been in their geographical expansions across the land that they had simply come across this adversary or this opponent? Or could this ancient enemy have even been reached in other lands and other realities, what we may think of as portals or nexus points, an area where different lands completely overlap? The access to a dimension of pure chaos and insidious beings that we can't even begin to describe or think of in this day and age. We think we have an idea of the greatest terrors in the land and in our worst nightmares, but perhaps we can't even begin to come close to what actually faced our true ancestors in the distant past. What does seem clear, though, is that the leadership of this previous civilization was corrupted by some sort of terrifying influence, creatures that we may think of as demonic, or creatures that we may simply describe in that manner because we can't even begin to fathom them. As a result of the leadership being corrupted, they did not seek to protect their population as they were originally charged to do so, and acted against their interests. They ordered the population to seek survival below ground in subsurface areas. And this seems to be the account that we have. And keep in mind that this same pattern of events has been repeated, even in our more recent history, such as World War II, where we have accounts of numerous civilian populations seeking shelter underground to escape the bombers that were constantly raining down destruction over their heads every single day. Is it possible that this is merely the latest iteration in a series of events that reflects what happened in the past? If this previous government or the leaders of this civilization that existed before ours had become corrupted and they were then ordering the civilization to try to survive by engaging in means that were against their best interest. What was really the purpose of these caves, and why do we have so many caves across the land? These are just the known caves in the United States alone, and there are some that suggest that all of these cave systems are actually connected. It is even possible that there could be a deeper surface of caves, another whole level if you will. Now, what's the origin of these caves? Are these the foundations of great structures? Were these purpose-built survival shelters for the last reset event in the civilization that preceded ours? Or could it be a combination? Could they originally be the remains of structures from a previous era that preceded the civilization before ours, that they attempted to repurpose into survival compounds? Some of the underground cities that we have in places such as Turkey and other locations seem to indicate that this is exactly what happened. Although you might be surprised to know that you don't have to go to Turkey to find underground locations that indicate that there were civilizations and settlements that seem to be built to survive a reset event. Take any asylum in the United States from the Kirkbride plan, and every single one has extensive subsurface tunnels. As though someone knew and planned that there was going to be some terrifying event of destruction that seemed to come from the sky and was going to lead to complete destruction of the land. Why is it we always have references to underground travel, underground railroads? Is it just programmed into our more recent history? Or is it once again a reference to something else that happened? That there really was an attempt to survive and escape this destructive event? And what was this destructive event, this reset, this end of the last civilization? Did they finally fall to this ancient enemy? It seems that they did. And as a result, their entire population was destroyed, except for the segments of population that were directed to try to seek survival below ground. Now, did they actually seek survival, or was that a way in which the entire population was changed? We actually have accounts and folklore of people who talk about an event that completely destroyed the land, a cleansing fire, something that you might think of as plasma fire, or something that we have recorded in our history as the destruction of many different cities. Now, once again, our official history tells us that the great cities of the land have been destroyed at different times. For example, the Chicago fire in the 1870s, the fire in London in 1666. And look up any and every city, whether we're talking Chicago, Boston, Nashville, or anywhere else across the land, and you'll find there seems to be a record of some kind of incredible destructive conflagration that completely reordered the entire city. There's even some interesting accounts in folklore that state that this fire came from the sky, from some sort of device in the sky. Is that just merely the product of a strange myth, a very hysterical population that is simply trying to explain the destruction of these cities? Or was the destruction of these cities a much more profound psychological event than the official history informs us? For example, the destruction of Chicago was not considered to be a very high casualty producing event, but it did result in the destruction of a lot of the central city, and it had to be completely rebuilt. It's quite the similar tale for London. Or what if there's another possibility? What if all these fires are actually the same event, and they all occurred, not separated by hundreds of years or decades, but even all within a year? Imagine that, every major city across the land being completely destroyed. And with the surviving population shifted underground, and some accounts saying that the survivors were under the rule of, again, a corrupted leadership. And that corrupted leadership forced them to completely forget their actual history. It influenced them to learn completely different languages and to completely drop their culture. There are numerous examples in even more recent science fiction films and even fantasy films. There are numerous images in the official history that seems to give accounts of a much more complete destruction of this previous civilization. Now think of what we've reviewed so far. We have this account of a previous civilization that was very high functioning and managed a balance between the individual and society. It was attacked by some sort of force that we can't begin to understand that had the ability to infiltrate it from the inside while threatening it physically from the outside. Somehow, in some way, there was an awareness of some incredible destructive event, a fire from the sky, complete and total destruction of all the cities. We don't exactly know what caused this incredible destructive fire. Was it a series of devices? Was it some kind of technology that we can't even begin to understand? It is even possible that the previous civilization, in developing its incredible energy capabilities and understanding of technology that we can't even begin to understand, and therefore almost seems like magic to us, and would certainly seem like magic to our ancestors, that perhaps that's the way they explain it. That in some way the delicate balance of our previous civilization with the natural environment was disturbed. Or perhaps they'd brought about some other destructive force in their meddling with accessing other physical realms and other realities. We have numerous accounts and tales that talk about the destruction of these cities. And we're not just talking about one city at a time. We're talking about every single city. And let's even take the recent account that we looked at in the town of Dyerville in Iowa. A relatively small town, populated in the 1800s, of course, and yet there's a very strange account of the origin of the settlers in Dyerville. Stated to be two different groups of settlers from the official history, one group being English and the other group being German. The official history says that the English group of settlers in Dyerville just simply moved on, and there's really no record of what happened to them. And then the German settlers took up residence, and they were the ones who built the Great Basilica. But there's a lot of folklore. There are many individuals who still tell different tales of what actually happened. These survivors, the two groups of survivors, we consider them English and German, who actually had to deal with the effects of the reset event. They sought refuge in caves nearby, specifically Maquoketa Caves near Maquoketa, Iowa, and then even the caves south of Dubuque. There are many incredible churches and edifices that are located in Dyerville and in the nearby small unincorporated town of Petersburg. Far too many churches, even to this day, to serve the population. So what's really the story behind this? Why do we have this folklore that gives us something that seems to conflict with the official history? Or maybe I shouldn't use the word conflict. It seems to augment what we have with the official history. We have details from some older individuals who still tell these tales of folklore. Now, some of these people do seem to put more veracity into these tales, that they're actually telling an account of an event that really happened. So who were these two groups of people originally, this group of English and this group of German settlers? Well, it would appear, going off the folklore and taking it at face value, that one group was a group from the caves just south of what is now the city of Dubuque, and the other group was from the caves of Maquoketa. That both of these groups had been forced into the caves by the order of their leaders in the previous civilization, and they completely lost their own sense of identity. They didn't know their own history. They didn't understand the technological achievements anymore of their previous civilization. They were even required to learn different languages, as though they adopted entirely different customs. Now, this may sound absurd, and people always ask the question, well, how could such a thing happen? How could people forget? How could people not know their own history? Well, if someone didn't actually tell you your own history, how would any of us know what actually happened in the 1800s? It's not that long ago. Over 125 years ago, what do we have? The defense will be, we have written records, and these are infallible written records. Maybe. But could they have been changed? Could they have been altered? It is possible that they are completely correct, but there's so many discrepancies. There's the actual presence of the city of Dubuque on the Mississippi, a very impressive old world city which contains a lot of old world architecture. In fact, there are many other towns and cities up and down the Mississippi that seem to give us a completely different origin story. And not just along the rivers, there are also isolated towns and incredible structures in places you would never expect to look. And so what do we have when we look at this story of these two groups of settlers? The folklore goes on to tell us that when they came out from their caves lacking leadership, and they found themselves inundated in a land that was completely arid, desiccated, and destroyed. Now yes, we all know that today Iowa and the surrounding Midwest states of the United States are really considered the breadbasket of the United States. This is some of the most fertile soil considered in the world, and everyone can grow crops, soybeans, and the land is fitted for an agrarian civilization. And yet there is an account of a horrific terror that these groups of survivors faced, the year of the Black Sun. When they tried to find their own survival after coming out of the caves, there was nothing for them to subsist on. There was nothing for them to eat, and there was very little water. It seemed that whatever this incredible reset event was, that it completely destroyed all the facets of the land to provide for the people. And so they found themselves in a very desperate state. What were they going to do to survive? There are different accounts of what they actually faced while they were in the caves. And this again comes from the folklore. I mean, there's always the difficult lineage of tracing the actual settlers of German descent in Iowa and the English settlers. And it should be noted there's virtually no other record, or very few records, of English settlers in Iowa. Iowa was stated to be settled exclusively by Germans, as are many other locations in the United States, nearby Wisconsin notwithstanding. So what was really happening? These settlers were actually trying to survive. They were looking for any implements of remaining technology, just as we would if we suddenly found ourselves out in a land that had been utterly destroyed by an apocalypse. What do we subsist on? What do we eat? What water is available? As we understand it, the two groups of settlers struck out, and the nearest intact location that they found, where they may have found something that they could have subsisted on, was in the small town of Dyerville. Dyerville, a town that exists to this day, known for being the home of the more recent Field of Dreams in the eponymous film, and it also contains a very elaborate and tremendous basilica, a minor basilica of the Roman Catholic Church. And we've looked at this structure before. Now, where does the folklore go from here? What happened once these groups of survivors actually found this area? Well, there's conflicting accounts among the folklore. And some say that the group of English settlers actually began meddling with the structure, the basilica. The basilica known as St. Francis Xavier, which still stands to this day. Now, the official history tells us that the construction of this basilica actually occurred in the late 1880s, and that it was built by the generous donation of the local farmers who seemed to be quite prosperous in the area, and they were able to provide enough money for its astronomical cost of construction. And it's safe to say that the Basilica of St. Francis Xavier in Dyerville will be the tallest structure in that town for the next 1,000 years. But what happened when these two groups of settlers actually came across this basilica? Well, as we understand it, the English group of settlers, or at least the group that's identified as English according to the folklore, they began meddling with the basilica. They didn't understand its original technological applications, because all the knowledge had been lost while they were surviving in the caves for who knows how long of a period of time. And yes, the folklore does indicate that the people were in the caves for several generations, and that when they came out of the caves, they sought simply to survive, wandering across an arid land. The German settlers settled south of the town originally, and began operating on a group of rudimentary farms. But survival was very difficult, as at this time this was not the fertile soil that we associate with Iowa, but the destroyed, arid, and desiccated soil that had followed whatever it was with the fire in the land. And so the English group of settlers sought to utilize the power of the structure, what we call a basilica, a cathedral, and it may have had a very different purpose. Was it part of some larger apparatus? Were all of these cathedrals actually part of a greater world machine, if you will? And that in their meddling with it, what the folklore says is that the English settlers actually opened up a portal to a dark and insidious dimension. And as a result of opening the portal to this dark and insidious dimension, they allowed a much more terrifying and very evil force to overrun the land. In fact, there's even references to what this deity may have been called. There are references of Crom Cruach and Moloch. Oddly enough, very similar references to a terrifying deity, a creature, one of the old ones that demanded the sacrifice of children. It's very strange that even though Moloch is associated with Carthaginian origins, or North Africa, and Crom Cruach is associated with Irish origins, that they have many similar story beats to them, that they almost seem to be exactly the same character. And so we really have to ask this question: was this a character in a myth, or was this a real figure, a real force of terror that did actually exist and afflicted the land with its presence, demanding that in order for these settlers to prosper, in order to simply have food and bountiful harvests, that they had to sacrifice their own children? It's very strange and bizarre, and without hesitation, we understand that these settlers and these people did sacrifice their own children to this terrifying deity, all in the name of bountiful harvests for corn and milk and even life returning to the land. That's the understanding of the folklore in any event. And it's a terrifying story. And we do have more examples of a similar story being told in other parts of the land, not just in Dyersville, Iowa. You can find this story in Ireland, in Africa, numerous mythical accounts in Asia. The idea of the sun itself being blocked out by a solar eclipse that lasted for an entire year. That with the presence of this dark entity, whether you want to call it Crom Cruach or Moloch, or if it had an entirely different name, it seems to be something where the land was bathed in darkness, and there were no stars that were seen at night. The only thing actually seen at night being the blood red moon. The blood red moon that accompanied the sacrifices. But it should be noted that even after these sacrifices, that was not enough for Crom Cruach or Moloch. And all of his followers, or all the English settlers in the Dyersville folklore, were killed in a fire that lasted several days. It wasn't until a survivor, a mage, or some sort of individual containing wisdom, somehow possessing it from the old civilization, came and managed to turn off or end the influence and the access from the portal, knowing the technological application and actually using it within what is today the Basilica. Apparently the nearby church in Petersburg played some sort of role, but we don't know any more of the details than that. It seems as though the actual oral account has lost a lot of the details. Now again, this is just merely the Dyersville story. We understand that the English settlers disappeared, and then the German settlers actually brought about in the town of Dyersville, and the town still stands to this day. But there are other accounts across the land that are very similar stories to this. A group of people seeking survival, deciding to put their faith in a very dark and horrific deity, or perhaps some sort of figure of chaos that because of the portals was actually able to access our land. We think that we deal with the worst forces of the ancient enemy every day in our current physical land, but is it possible that there are much worse variations out there, and that in the effect of meddling with this remaining technology of the old world, this surviving technology of the old civilization, that they enabled access through these portals? And that's why we have this account of the year without the sun, or the year of the black sun. And what exactly was the black sun? What's it really referring to? Why does Dyersville still stand to this day, and why does it have this incredible basilica? A basilica that was actually named and designated by the Pope because of its impressive structural capacity. And what were these forces of evil that came in the past? And what was this black sun? Was it a solar eclipse as we understand it? Or was it something else entirely? What exactly is the explanation of celestial events that we have? And it should be noted that there are many different celestial events that seem to defy our understanding of many different models of what our existence actually is. So how exactly do we reconcile all this? Are all these myths and legends and folklore just simply a primitive and paranoid people trying to explain forces that they didn't understand in the land? We seem to think that we have such a great understanding of what happens now and what we're facing now, and yet we have so many people that oftentimes live in fear and simply move from one event of fear to the next without really trying to understand exactly what the origin of our entire existence really is, or thinking that they understand it. and then simply not asking any more questions. Perhaps the most interesting thing to me, though, about this year of the Black Sun is this entire time where the land was overrun completely by evil forces. And it wasn't just the fact that there were strange creatures and demons reputed to be running through the land at the time. There are even accounts that state that the people did engage in willing sacrifice, that they did decide to actually destroy everything that they had. Now, you may recall in one of our previous explorations, we theorized that there was a safe zone that was set up by the previous civilization, a safe zone that was bounded by the 4 current state capitals of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois. And there are other very impressive structures. For example, the Cathedral of St. Paul, which is relatively close to the Minnesota state capital. Now, originally, I had theorized that this safe zone was set up by the previous civilization to allow the population to survive. But after studying some more of the folklore and talking to some different individuals, it seems that was not actually the intent behind the establishment of this safe zone. And looking back into this live stream exploration that we did, this safe zone that seemed to be bound by a diamond, the leadership being corrupted merely told the people that they were going to be safe in this particular area, that the caves and the presence of the Basilica of Dyerville, or St. Francis Xavier Basilica, that resides in Dyerville, that's also near the middle of this designated area, was actually an entirely different event. That it seems that the ancient enemy had contrived this entire event. Much in the same way that, if you're familiar with the Fallout universe, or the Fallout intellectual property, where groups of survivors were sent to different vaults to survive a nuclear apocalypse, the real intention behind sending them there was something entirely different. Survival was the last thing that was intended for any of these people. It's almost as though these 2 groups of settlers that we have near Dyersville or Dubuque, Iowa, were actually intended to find the remnants of this technology from the previous civilization. And while the technology could be used to bring about bountiful harvests and tremendous connection and balance between the artificial and the natural of the land, it could also be corrupted. It could also be used to bring about terrifying destructive forces, access, if you will, to a dimension of pure chaos. And that seems to be the exact story that we have here with the folklore behind Dyersville. But there are many other examples of folklore and legend that you can find, where the land was beset by chaos and forces of darkness, where there was a year of the Black Sun. What exactly is the Black Sun? Is it actually some other celestial body that does actually blot out our entire sun? Could it have been possible that it really did happen for an entire year? Or is it something else entirely? Is it referring to something very different than what we understand? Is it actually referring to some sort of object, or what actually happens in the sky is nothing what we think happens in the sky? It could even be a theatrical display designed to bring about some sort of profound psychological response. We do have multiple accounts, though, of the fire that came from the sky, the fire that came from the sky that destroyed multiple cities. And so, was there actually a safe zone, or was it just simply the perception of the safe zone? That these different structures had entirely different uses, not just the incredible Basilica of St. Francis Xavier, as we call it now in Dyersville, Iowa, but the great state capitals. Could they have been part of this larger machine that played a different role in entire geographies? Just imagine that, if there's some kind of technology that really involves these structures being connected. Because we really have to look grand scale here to actually understand what may have really happened. We certainly can't explain the construction of these structures with our given history, because virtually all of them were constructed from 1850 to 1900, during a time frame before the widespread use of heavy machinery. The usual explanations that we have is that there was an infinite source of highly skilled labor available, and there was no reason to question the logistics behind it. There's no reason to question the fact that there are 29 different types of marble in the Iowa State Capitol. even though it's well known there are no marble quarries to this day in Iowa. And how exactly do we explain the construction of this very impressive basilica in Dyerville, a town currently of only a few thousand people? In the official population account, when the basilica was constructed, the population of Dyerville was stated to only be 1,000. So how exactly did these farmers actually provide generous donations to build this incredible edifice? The Iowa state capitol itself being attributed to the refund of Civil War grants to the state as a result of fielding so many regiments to fight in the United States Civil War. And you'll find similar stories behind the other incredible state capitals. We certainly know that there was no federal income tax at the time, as all the state capitals were constructed before 1913. So trying to reconcile exactly what happened in our official history with what we have with this account of the Year of the Black Sun doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. It does, however, make a lot of sense if we have a completely different view of what really transpired. If all of these structures had been standing all this time, and that they were remnants of the previous civilization, that they represented some incredible, larger apparatus, not just the single isolated structure, but all the structures being connected in a way that we don't entirely understand. Now, some people will suggest that they're connected on some sort of ley lines or some sort of geographical pattern, although our actual understanding of how the land is laid out is very, very limited and difficult to understand. Because if you recall, during our map exploration, or the true map of the realm exploration, the actual shape of the land can be distorted, and maps can be distorted, while they can still provide accurate coordinates. And if you want to go watch that exploration, I suggest you do so now. So, would this diamond even look like a diamond, or would it look like something else entirely, while still having accurate coordinates? Well, that's a question I leave to you to answer. Because a lot of people think they know all the answers, but if they know all the answers, then why are they still seeking out those who ask questions? It's a question you're not supposed to ask, apparently. Whether you believe in the veracity of this account or not, or if you think there is any veracity with the fact that we have folklore that connects with these theories that we have of the old world, it should be noted that there are far too many connections to just simply ignore or dismiss. And you really have to just simply ignore and dismiss these connections just at the fact that you have a very flimsy explanation. Yes, that's all you need, one flimsy explanation, and you could dismiss this entire period, if you will, of the Year of the Black Sun. But is that what really happened? Did we have all of this expansion and all this conflict in the way that we think that we did? Because it seems that we did have a lot of conflict and a lot of difficulty that occurred in the land of the past. But what's the real story? Why do we have this entire account of this Year of the Black Sun, and what is it really representing? Is this exactly the folklore that we have of locals from Dyersville, Iowa? Do you simply accept the fact that this incredible basilica, this cathedral, this tremendous edifice really was constructed by the donations of farmers? Of course, we have no details on the contractors. And what about the continuous story of Moloch, or Crom Cruach, with its alternate origins? It should be noted that Moloch has made numerous appearances in various films from the early 20th century. So why is it that this character doesn't exactly go away? Why do we continuously have these references of this presence of this terrifying evil on the land? Who is this Moloch or this Crom Cruach? Is this really some kind of terrifying deity? Or is it one of the old ones, perhaps better described by the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft? Perhaps both perspectives can be true in a way. It's intriguing, though, looking at the Celtic or the Irish version of Crom Cruach, crooked-backed. And that was what the god was called. Now, is it really a pagan belief, or is that merely an association that we have? Understanding true history is difficult because history is constantly being reevaluated all the time. Even the official history is being reevaluated or revised because somehow events become more clear. And maybe that is the situation. What was this Crom Cruach? Was it some kind of terrifying being that we might even define as an alien being? Or is it something else that completely defies all conventions of existence? And many people who think or claim that they have all the answers and yet for some inexplicable reason are still searching for answers will no doubt try to dismiss such accounts as this. And it may be that these are just simply fantastic accounts and that all of these overlapping similarities are merely coincidence. But what I find fascinating is that these are a lot of coincidences to just simply ignore and dismiss without examining them. Did the people of Dyerville, these people that we associate with English settlers who just seem to have disappeared, did they really bring about some kind of chaotic and horrific demonic force that nearly overwhelmed the entire land? It appears that whatever this evil really was, or this deity, or this terrifying threat, it did actually threaten the land with eternal darkness. As it was, we have folklore that indicates that the land was bathed in darkness for an entire year. And why do we always have all of these mythical depictions of these strange creatures, whether they're on old maps or old texts? Ah yes, history that will tell us that the good people of medieval Europe knew that the world was round because there was a circle. And they also seem to know that there were terrifying fire-breathing creatures that were all over the land, because that's also on the maps. But what was the real intention behind this terrifying being, this Moloch, once it was brought into our physical realm? Was it just simply enough to demand the sacrifice of children? And because the people were willing to sacrifice their own children, that wasn't enough for this horrific deity, and the entire people were killed in the very act of worship. That's what the legend really says. And coincidentally, it says it for both Crom Cruach and Moloch, despite the fact that these two deities and these two thoughts of philosophical or theological belief are vastly divided according to the official history. There are many accounts, whether we're considering religious texts or even other historical accounts, that indicate that maybe these were morality tales. Simply something told to warn the people to behave a certain way. Respect your laws, respect others, otherwise horrific demonic forces will beset the land. And yet, it's intriguing to me that we always have this explicit detail when it comes to this destruction. And then we layer on all of these other details that we have of the official historical account. For example, the destruction of all of these cities, even though they occurred at different times. And it should be noted, there are true accounts of sacrifice, and the sacrifice of children in the past, in the official history, in addition to myth and various forms of odd accounts that indicate that this was a terrifying event that did really happen. How would you really deal with it? If you had survived in a cave, if the only accounts that you had were what your parents and your grandparents had told you? And then when you came out and you're just simply trying to survive, and by inadvertently meddling with something, you had brought about an event where the black sun existed in the world for over a year. And the next thing you knew, you were confronted with this all-powerful being that seemed to demand the very sacrifice of your children. And feeling that you had no other choice for your survival, you acquiesced to this demand. And as a result of this, the Year of the Black Sun did in fact truly happen. And it didn't just happen in Dyersville, Iowa. It happened at varied locations all across the land, and all within the same time period. It's just that the event was recorded in different ways. And with the way we have our official history now, the actual event is spread about, so we can't really understand exactly what happened. But it is mentioned, and it is known, both in the official history and in the myth, that these events did seem to happen. Now, to what extent did they happen? To what variations did they happen? Why should we be terrified of the Year of the Black Sun? Well, it seemed to be the one time that, as difficult as we may think that our current existence is, and with all the drawbacks of this current reality, that we could have been facing a much more horrific reality. Continuously bathed in darkness, forced to contend with horrifying creatures, demanding sacrifice, demanding the very torment of humanity. We oftentimes want to say that this is merely a period of the worst things that could be. But is it? Or is it possible that things could be much better? Or could they be much worse? We seem to have different schools of thought that go both ways. Perhaps it's best that we remain aware of these tales and these accounts, that we realize that it could be possible that there are terrifying entities and beings out there with powers that are beyond our wildest imagination. And even with all of this power, even with all this influence, it's interesting to note that Crom Cruach, Moloch, or all the other names that we have for these demonic entities, require the will, the submission, the willful submission of the people that they seek to dominate. That, in other words, the best way to resist them, whether we're talking about the ancient enemy or these entities, is simply not to give in to their will. It's simply to resist them using the power of our will alone. Is it possible that that was what was really corrupted in the older civilization? That the real reason that it fell was that it simply lost its will to resist? That the leaders, for whatever reason, became corrupted, seeking notoriety in the moment? And that's why we have all these accounts of these strange beings, these horrific demons that would come in the night and negatively influence the leaders and those that were charged with safeguarding the previous civilization. Therefore, there are two components of the story. The component of how the previous civilization fell with the corruption of its leaders, and then with the survivors, simply trying to build a new life and inadvertently contacting a chaotic, what we'd consider demonic entity, bringing about the near destruction of the land. Is that what all this art is really referring to? Is that what all this folklore is referring to? Is that why we actually have a very prominent appearance of Moloch in the 1920s German science fiction film Metropolis? Yes, Moloch does make an appearance in that film. And it is very profoundly connected with what's actually happening in terms of the will of the people, and even the will of the very leaders of the city of Metropolis. Why do we have all these references to child sacrifice? It's a very terrifying thing to consider, and yet it does still exist in many different ways. Now, people even use the word, well, I can sacrifice things if it will bring about a more beneficial life to me. Are they right to do so or think so? The obvious answer would be no, and yet for some unknown reason, it seems to be a moral question that we still continuously debate to this day. Is there a entity such as Moloch that's still out there somewhere, confined to a different physical realm? Is it possible that the remaining structures that we have could still operate some sort of larger scale apparatus, a world machine, if you will, that could possibly open up that dark portal? Could it be possible that someone even now is meddling with this technology that could bring about a return of the year of the Black Sun? Or could it be even more than a year? Could it be 100 years, 1,000 years, or an eternity of the Black Sun if we're not careful? It may seem like it's all doom and gloom, but don't forget that perhaps the best concept to be realized from all this, whether we're talking myth, official history, or something in between, is that the choice is always left to us. That as long as we retain our true will and our true sense of self, we have the ability not just to resist any sort of deity or evil force or evil will, but the ability to completely overcome it. And oftentimes, the only thing that prevents us from doing so is succumbing to our own internal fears. What did these people really face? Were they completely without hope during this year of the Black Sun? That they only had a few brief moments and there was really no refuge, no respite from it? All they had to look forward to was the darkness of each and every day. No stars, only the blood-red moon. Was there ever any way out, or did they simply give in to despair? These are terrifying thoughts and considerations, and yet they seem to be the very thoughts and considerations that our ancestors or our predecessors faced. Because remember, while we do have some folklore that corroborates the account from the vicinity of Dyersville in Iowa, there are other stories all across the land that do seem to indicate that something very similar happened. And much like with the varied city fires that officially happen at different points in history, with vast differences in when they happened, what if it was all one event? What if it was all one event that happened within the same 1 to 2 year period? And then the question you're asking is, how exactly was this resolved? How exactly was this terrifying deity, this being Moloch or Crom Cruach, actually removed from the land? And that the terrifying reality of an eternity of the Black Sun was prevented from transpiring? It seems to be that the legend in the folklore, which oddly enough does match the same legend in folklore of the appearance of St. Patrick. St. Patrick, a wise individual, a religious man, who rose to face the terror of Crom Cruach and banished him to the realm beyond. Oddly enough, if you look at one of the paintings in St. Francis Xavier to this day, it does seem to give the indication of a portal that was actually sealed, and commemorating the return of the incredible sun. Or maybe you interpret this differently. But just really think of that, if that's the way that the story was actually resolved. Did it involve some individual who still retained knowledge of the old world that was actually able to interface with the technology and end this threat? Well, let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Greetings, channel members, and I decided to share the strange tales with all of you. I'll be going back, though, and spelling out what my thoughts are on each of these particular tales and how they fit into the old world of the Prime Explorers. But I thought they were important enough to convey to everybody. There's a little note, though. Of these stories, 19 are based on easily found facts, but the others tell about ghosts. Ghosts and reports of ghosts are not easy to check. Without objective clues, ghost hunters must depend on the word of the viewer. Did he or she really see something? Who can say? What we can say is this. In each of the ghost stories that we're going to be looking at, a person thought they saw something very strange, and each of the viewers was convinced that what they saw was an actual ghost. These people honestly felt they were reporting what was true. That is why these ghost stories have been included in this book called Strange but True. But remember, as you read them, we only have the word of the viewer. What a wonderful objective note. It might not surprise you to find out that we are reading or recounting tales from a book from the 1980s. And yet, oddly enough, all of these accounts at the time were taken as historically accurate. And yet since then, the so-called skeptoids, our favorite people such as Brian Dunning and others, Larry Kush, seem to have come out of nowhere and have gone back and have caused us to question these accounts. Well, as always, I remind you to remain objective, and I hope you enjoy this. First story, he carried a curse. His first name was Robert, and he might have been President of the United States, had he chosen to run for the office. Instead, he served his country ably in subordinate roles, as Secretary of War under 2 presidents, and as Minister to Great Britain under a 3rd. In private life, he was a successful lawyer, and became head of the Pullman Company. Yet he came to believe that he carried a special curse. As a youthful captain in the Army, he stood beside the bed of President Lincoln only hours after Lincoln had been shot. The president died. As Secretary of War, he hurried to the railroad station in Washington, D.C. to tell President Garfield he could not accompany him to Elberon, New Jersey. He arrived to find the president had just been shot. The president died. As a leading businessman, he was invited by President McKinley to meet him at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. When he arrived, he learned that the president had just been shot. The president died. From that day forward, Robert never allowed himself near a president. He declined all invitations to the White House. If they only knew, he remarked in private, they wouldn't want me. Once upon being asked if he would be at an event where a president was to appear, he reportedly said, "No, I'm not going, and they'd better not invite me. There's a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." The man who believed that somehow he had been the instrument of death to 3 martyred presidents was laid to rest forever in 1926, 61 years after the assassination of his father, Abraham Lincoln. The Floating Coffin. On the morning of August 12, 1775, the Greenland whale ship Herald was picking her way among the icebergs of the North Atlantic. Suddenly the lookout bellowed, "A ship! A ship! West ahead!" On deck, the Herald's captain turned in surprise. Some 3 miles away, he saw masts poking above an iceberg. Slowly, a 3-masted schooner drifted into view. Her sails hung in tatters. Ice coated her spars and rigging. She glistened in the sun. Captain Warren studied her through his telescope. He saw no signs of life. Veering close, he hailed the strange ship. Silence greeted his shouts. The schooner continued on her seemingly aimless way. "Lower the longboat," Captain Warren ordered. "I'm going to have a look." His crew were superstitious and had no mind to venture aboard a ghostly ship. Nevertheless, they obeyed. Captain Warren picked 8 men and rowed over. As the longboat neared the schooner's stern, the men made out her name. Octavius. She was unknown to them. Again, Captain Warren hailed her. Only rotting timbers and the wind in the loose rigging answered him, crackling and whispering. With 4 of his crew, the captain climbed aboard. The deck was slippery with ice-encrusted snow. Seeing no one topside, the boarding party went below. In the crew's quarters, they found 28 men, frozen to death. Each lay in his bunk, heavily bundled in blankets and clothing. The fierce Arctic cold had perfectly preserved their bodies. Next, the investigating crew entered the cabin of the captain, whose body was seated in a chair by a work table. In a cabin behind this one were 3 more corpses. A woman lay in one bunk, her head resting lifelike on her elbow. The body of a man sat cross-legged on the floor in one corner. His hands held a flint and a piece of steel. Before him was a pile of wood shavings. Death had overtaken him as he had struggled to light a fire. Alongside the man was a sailor's jacket. Captain Warren lifted it. Beneath was the body of a small boy. The men of the Herald had seen enough. They wanted to get off at once. But the captain wanted to investigate further. He managed to inspect the galley, but he found no food there. But then his men were on the verge of panic and threatening mutiny. Taking the schooner's logbook, Captain Warren reluctantly returned to his ship. He watched the Octavius and her cargo of death drift northward out of sight. She would never be seen again. Later, when he retired to his cabin to read the logbook, the captain discovered that all but the first and last pages were missing. The sailor to whom he had entrusted the book had allowed the rest to fall out. The first page included the information that Octavius had departed England, bound for the China trade, on September 10, 1761, 14 years earlier. The last page had but a single entry. It was dated November 11, 1762, and read, "We have now been enclosed in ice 17 days. Our approximate position is longitude 160 degrees west, latitude 75 degrees north. The fire went out yesterday, and our master has been trying to rekindle it, but without success. He has handed the steel and flint to the mate. The master's son died this morning, and his wife says she no longer feels the terrible cold. The rest of us have no relief from the agony." Captain Warren's eyes returned to the words. Longitude 160 degrees west, latitude 75 degrees north. The meaning was incredible. On the day of the last entry in the logbook, Octavius had been icebound in the Arctic Ocean, north of Point Barrow, Alaska, thousands of miles from where Captain Warren had just boarded her. A continent of ice lay between these 2 points. What Octavius had negotiated was the legendary Northwest Passage. For hundreds of years, sea captains had sought a shorter route between the Atlantic and the Pacific to carry trade between Europe and the Far East. The Northwest Passage was a dream that could eliminate the long voyage around the tip of South America. Apparently, the captain of the Octavius also had decided to try to find the Northwest Passage. Instead of sailing home to England around South America, he had tried, and like so many before, he had found death instead. But the Octavius had succeeded on her own. Year after year she sailed on, her ship's wheel unattended. She inched eastward through the vast fields of ice, blindly withstanding the fury of the elements, till she finally floated again in the North Atlantic. Not until 1906, 130 years later, did another ship, Gajoa, commanded by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, navigate the Northwest Passage. But Octavius had been first, carrying a captain and a crew who had been frozen for 13 years. The Night Thing. What was it that walked through stone walls, jumped over 18-foot haystacks, and stepped across a river 2 miles wide? Beast, bird, or the devil? To this day, no one knows. But something did what couldn't be done. And it left its footprints in the towns and villages of Devonshire, in southern England a century ago. On the night of Thursday, February 8, 1885, snow began to fall over Devonshire, a little before 8 o'clock. It fell in uninterrupted silence until nearly midnight. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Harley Filk Henry Filk, a banker, stopped from his house. He paused briefly to admire the blanket of snow. Then he noticed a train of footprints across his enclosed yard. Each print was U-shaped, as if made by the shoe of a pony or donkey. Henry frowned. The footprints, or hoofprints, were all in a line, one in front of the other. No man or animal walked like that, as if on a tightrope. Henry was not a curious fellow. He shrugged, went into his bakehouse, and started his day's labor. An hour later, the whole town was abuzz. Others had discovered the hoofprints. Eagerly, they sought to catch a glimpse of the creature responsible. At the start, it was all great fun, but the longer the trackers followed the single line of prints, the stronger grew their sense of uneasiness. Whatever had visited them during the night possessed extraordinary powers. In places, the hoofprints had led right up to the garden walls of stone as high as 12 feet. The prints stopped at the base and resumed on the other side as though no wall stood in the way. Could the creature have jumped over? Hardly. The depth of the prints in the snow never changed. Neither did their size, which measured 4 inches by 2.5 inches, and without exception they were spaced 8 inches apart. Moreover, the trail never doubled back, though it led up to every house in town. Why? Was the creature marking the occupants? While the people of Topsham puzzled nervously, the mystery spread and deepened. As far south as Totanis, the same single trail had been seen in dozens of places. The distance between the two towns is about 96 miles on a straight line. The snowstorm had ended at midnight. 6 hours later, Henry discovered the tracks. In 6 hours, what could have moved fast enough on a wandering zigzag course to reach points 96 miles apart? Nothing known in that day or unearthed in this. Prints were found in cemeteries, atop wagons, on beaches and roofs, in woods and marketplaces, and up to and beyond 18-foot-high haystacks. Prints were tracked to the edge of the Exe River, where it was 2 miles wide, and picked up again on the opposite bank. A similar crossing was found a few miles to the south. Everywhere the horseshoe prints were the same, 4 inches by 2.5 inches at intervals of 8 inches. Nowhere in the snow was there a sign that the creature had rested. Fun and curiosity gave way to uneasiness. Presently, superstition and fear took command. As the snow melted, the tracks blurred. The prints began to resemble a cloven hoof. Who but the devil had a cloven hoof? Who but the devil would peer into the dwellings of God-fearing folk and mark the sinners? Women and children hid in their homes behind barred doors and shutters. The men fetched their dogs. Armed with muskets, pistols, clubs, and pitchforks, they grimly tramped the countryside. Apparently, nobody paused to consider how to capture the devil once he was cornered. That difficulty never arose. The night prowler, beast, phantom, or devil passed unseen. Plenty of snow fell in the days that followed, but the tracks never reappeared. For weeks afterward, men went about carrying weapons and lonely trails were avoided. Clergymen preached about the signs in our midst as warnings from heaven about drinking, swearing, and loose living. The London Times and other newspapers carried many columns about the strange hoofprints. Expert opinion abunded like wild berries. The prints, it was claimed, were made by giant leaping rats, huge rabbits, birds, otters, toads, kangaroos. Richard Owen, a respected naturalist, blamed the badger without ever having seen the prints. None of the explanations fitted the facts. Thousands of hoof prints in a single line, exactly 4 inches by 2.5 inches, exactly 8 inches apart. Roaming tirelessly, in absolute silence at uncanny speed over and through every obstacle. The men and women who struggle with the mystery are gone, but the questions linger. Where had the night thing come from? Where was it going? And when would it walk again? The Clue in the Sand. One of the strangest of all detective cases took place on a beach in France in 1888. It began the day as a businessman named André Monet and his wife arrived at the small French seaside town of Saint-Andrés for a vacation. Late that night, Monet left his hotel to take a swim before going to bed. He never returned. Early the next morning, a boy discovered him laying on the beach, dead of a bullet wound. The French National Police sent Detective Robert Ledru to investigate. Oddly, Ledru happened to be in Le Havre, which was within walking distance of Saint-Adresse. Ledru was selected to go to the scene of the crime because of his reputation, not because he chanced to be nearby. He was considered brilliant. Not only was he the youngest detective on the police force, he was easily the most successful at solving mysteries. It was claimed that he could sniff a used but empty glass and identify the drink, and could look at a footprint and describe the person who made it. His superiors believed him a wizard at swiftly finding and reading clues. The truth was something else. Robert Ledru was neither swift nor brilliant. He was patient and thorough. Far from solving mysteries at a glance, he worked slowly and carefully. He spent hours and even days at the scene of a crime, going over every foot of ground. He scarcely slept until he had checked out every clue, every alibi, every suspect. By dogged determination, he had built a dazzling record. That record was his lifeblood, and he did everything to further it. For example, he never admitted that he had toiled around the clock, tracing the owner of a button. In his report, he wrote only that he had deduced who the owner was. To his superiors, he seemed the ideal man to send to the beach at St. Adresse. And he was. No one but Robert Ledru could have solved the murder of Andre Monet. But when the great detective arrived, he could uncover no leads. The murdered man had no known enemies. He had not been robbed. His only heir was his wife, and she had waited up for him in the hotel lobby in view of the night clerk until 2:30 a.m. Since the coroner had fixed the time of death at no later than 2 a.m., she was cleared. Ledru was making no progress. Worse, the many nights during which he had passed up sleep in order to work on his case were catching up with him. He was exhausted, and his nerves were strung taut. Oh, how he longed for time to rest. How he would sleep, peaceful sleep. He had told no one about his nightmares. But before he could rest, however, there was this new murder to solve. Night fell, and still his efforts led him no closer to the killer. He resorted to his tried and tested tools, patience and painstaking thoroughness. He marked a large circle around the spot where the body had lain. Lantern in hand, he examined every inch of sand, in and near the circle. Near midnight, he found the clue, a footprint. It told him the identity of the murderer, and it shook him to the bone, for the footprint was what he had been half-consciously looking for all along, and dreaded. The guilty man was someone he had known all his life. The struggle within Ledru was soul-wrenching. Should he turn the murderer in? Duty at last overcame every personal objection. After walking the beach for hours, Robert Ledru entered the police station. He had solved the case, he announced, and laid upon the desk a plaster cast of a footprint. It was of the left foot. The footprint unquestionably belonged to the murderer, the detective asserted. He had sneaked up behind his victim in stocking feet. As proof, Ledru pointed to the plaster cast. The first joint of the big toe is missing. Then he stopped and took off his own shoe. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I am the murderer." He had lost the first joint of the big toe on his left foot while a boy. The nightmares in which he saw himself commit murder had come true. Ledru was placed under arrest and eventually brought to trial. Respected doctors testified in his defense. Due to a rare mental condition, they stated, Robert Ledru was dangerous only at night. During the day, he was perfectly sane. The words of the doctors, plus a masterly pleas by his lawyer, saved Ledru from execution. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was carried out only in the hours between sunset and sunrise. During the daylight, he was set free to go wherever he chose. Robert Ledru died in his cell in 1939. For 51 years, he served his unique sentence, walking the streets during the day and returning at night to be locked up. The Elevator Operator. Frederick Blackwood, the famous British diplomat known as Lord Dufferin, once saved his life because he recognized a ghost. His encounter with the supernatural began while he was staying overnight at a friend's house in Ireland. He couldn't fall asleep, and all at once he was aware of something eerie, something he could not explain. With senses sharply alert, he got out of bed and went to the window. Moonlight of unusual brightness flooded the grounds. He heard moaning. He listened, tensing. There it came again. I must get a hold of myself, he thought. His mind shook off the stories he'd heard of haunted old Irish houses. It is the breeze stirring in the trees. The moaning grew steadily louder and closer as Lord Dufferin squinted into the deep shadows cast by the huge ancient trees. He saw something move. Then he heard panting. A man staggered from the shadows into the bright moonlight. He carried a long black box on his back, and he was moaning and panting under its weight. Lord Dufferin left his room and hurried out onto the lawn. In the full moonlight, he saw the black box was a coffin. "Here," he called. "What are you doing with that?" The man lifted his head from under his burden. Lord Dufferin saw his face and recoiled a step. It was a face so ugly and evil that he would never forget it. Was the man a grave robber? Lord Dufferin nerved himself. "What are you doing with that?" he called again. As he approached within a few strides, the man in the coffin disappeared before his eyes. Shaken, Lord Dufferin searched for signs of footprints in the dewy moonlit grass. There were none. Returning to his room, he wrote of the details of the bewildering experience in his diary. When he laid down his pen, he believed he had written an end to the matter, even if he would never forget that face. But ended the matter was not. Years passed, during which Lord Dufferin served England as ambassador to Italy and to Russia, and as Governor-General of Canada. Then in 1891 he was named ambassador to France, and in the city of Paris he met the ghost again. The place was the Grand Hotel. Lord Dufferin stood waiting for an elevator to take him to a reception. The other men in the lobby moved aside respectfully to let him enter first. The door opened. Lord Dufferin started forward, then froze as he saw the elevator operator. How could he forget that ugly, evil face? The operator was the same man he had seen carrying a coffin years before in Ireland, the man who had vanished into thin air. Calling upon all his self-control, Lord Dufferin betrayed no outward sign of terror. To the others waiting, Lord Dufferin mumbled an excuse and bid them go aboard. As they crowded into the elevator, he rushed to the hotel office. He must know who the man was. The crash sounded as he reached the office door. A cable had broken. The elevator had plunged 5 floors, killing everyone inside of it. At the insistence of Lord Dufferin, the secret services of England and France sought to learn the identity of the mysterious elevator operator. Who was he? Where had he come from? No one ever found out. Potemkin's Villages. The movies have never known a producer to equal the talents of Gregory Potemkin. Yet he did not make one picture. He made a country. He built pretty villages with little more than cardboard and paint. He peopled them with dancing peasants who were hurried from place to place, a step ahead of their unsuspecting audience. He did it all to make the woman he loved happy. She was Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, and they may have been secretly married, no one knows for sure. In 1783, Catherine had acquired the Crimea. She appointed Potemkin governor of the area. His job was to turn the barren land into thriving country. Potemkin went to work with a will and a vast imagination. He promised Catherine hundreds of improvements, and in the next 3 years made several trips north to the capital to report his successes. Catherine was thrilled with his words. She must see for herself. Potemkin had not made a wasteland bloom. He had, however, created the appearance of lush countryside for Catherine's pleasure. When Catherine expressed a desire to see it, he hastened ahead to make final arrangements. Catherine set out on her tour of the Crimea in a sleigh, a very heavy sleigh-like horse-drawn platform. It was the size of a small house, and the Empress took 40,000 followers with her. At every station along the route, 500 fresh horses were waiting, and at every station Catherine stared in delight. Houses had been repainted on the side facing her, and roofs repaired with cardboard. Young girls strewed flowers in her path. Old and sickly people had been locked indoors. Artificial trees blocked unsightly areas. Begging was forbidden. Everyone Potemkin had ordered must express happiness by smiles and gestures. Years before, Catherine had traveled the same road. She had seen the misery in the angry faces. She was overcome by the change. "Is not my little household prettily furnished?" she gasped to the French ambassador. All this was but a taste of what was to come. The real journey through Potemkin's fairyland began at the Dnieper River. 7 floating palaces, trailed by 80 smaller vessels, carried 3,000 persons past never-ending wonders. While Catherine and a royal party lay under silken awnings and dined on plates of gold, a storybook landscape streamed by. Villages decorated with triumphal arches, cattle grazing contentedly, carefree peasants dancing at dusk. Catherine could not guess the truth, that the wonderland vanished behind her. The triumphal arches were shakily thrown up. Farmhouses were without real roofs, windows, or doors. The villages were deserted. The cattle had been brought great distances without feed to make them graze contentedly. The carefree dancers were poor peasants, taught their steps by threats and beatings. They were packed into carts and carried further down the river to perform the next evening. Potemkin had spared no cost. At the 3 anchorages along the river, he had built a splendid new palace with every luxury. Each was adorned with a man-made waterfall, a park shaded by transplanted trees that withered and died after Catherine had departed. Leaving the river, the Empress traveled by carriage through villages alive with industry and smiling crowds. She had no way of knowing that Potemkin had whisked in every peasant for miles around to flesh out his roadside landscape. Catherine laid the cornerstone of a cathedral whose plans made St. Peter's in Rome look like a chapel. At Kherson, she viewed from afar a huge new fortress. At Sevastopol, while 180 musicians played at dinner, she looked out over the harbor at her new Black Sea fleet of warships. Potemkin had built the fleet in 2 years. The deck guns fired a salute. The climax came at Poltava. Potemkin staged a mock battle that reenacted the victory of Peter the Great on the same ground. Catherine went back to her capital, singing Potemkin's praises. The Crimea had been turned into the pride of all of Russia. She died without ever learning that the beautiful land was an invention of the man she loved and who loved her, and the greatest hoax in history. The sweeping panoramic landscapes give a very dramatic presentation of the incredible land that we have not looked at in great detail, the continent known as South America. And yet there are some incredible landscapes that match with wondrous cities that have been built in South America. What's the real story behind this continent? On the channel, we've only looked at South America so far in a few brief explorations where we've considered its exploration. But this is going to be our first real look overall at this incredible continent, in the southern latitudes officially. What's the mystery behind it, and how does it relate to our story of it being considered the New World? Is it possible that this architecture and that the remnants of a civilization that came before are still very present in South America? Today we're going to take our first overall look at this very impressive and exotic continent. Exotic for its unique landscapes and wondrous stories of civilization, as we begin our exploration of Tartaria in the New World. We begin by considering the account of South America being the New World. Now, of course, the America is named after explorer Amerigo Vespucci. I always wondered why they didn't go with the Vespucci. This was the New World, discovered by Christopher Columbus under Spanish and Portugal explorers' influences. Why would South America have more of a prominence initially than North America? Official history tells us that civilization developed earlier in South America than it did in North America. There were the Incans, and there were many other baseline civilizations present in South America, according to the official historical account. We look at the early maps, though, and we can see that there were many different depictions and displays of South America. Some show that there was not a great awareness in terms of what the shape of the continent actually looked like. There also seemed to be this evolving picture of what South America was. There is the famous depiction of how it was connected, supposedly, to Antarctica in the Piaris map, a Turkish naval officer working for the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the statement was that he had copied the maps from earlier maps. So who knows what the official account is, or what the lands looked like in the distant past. We do have the same plethora of maps, though, that show us that it appears that the understanding of the actual geography, and very much the cartography of South America, evolved with subsequent explorations. Official history tells us, though, that the focus was on South America, because for the early explorers, whether they were Spanish or Portuguese or wherever they came from, the only way to access the Pacific Ocean was beyond the Cape Horn, or through the Strait of Magellan. And indeed, many accounts state about how strategically important knowledge of the pilots or navigators of those sailing ships were to have of the charts that showed them how they could navigate to reach the Pacific Ocean. We've looked at the attempts to access the Pacific Ocean through the Northwest Passage, or in other words, in what's now the Arctic Ocean. And even here we can look and see how strategically important the Isthmus of Panama, as it would become to be known as, was. And notice how even here it's shown being north to south. And so therefore we understand why, according to the official historical account, that South America was so important. And yet we find so many great mysteries affiliated with South America. There's older accounts of civilizations that rose before they did in North America. We consider the account of the great civilization of Caral Supay. Caral Supay, which was contemporaneous with the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia. We're talking several thousand years ago, according to the official historical account. And if you ever actually visit this site in what is today Peru, you will be very enamored by these wondrous examples of geometric precision and the ability to move megalithic stones, at least what will be told are megalithic stones today. There also appears to be the ruins of what you may consider to be amazing structures. Some could call them pyramids, others would call them ziggurats, and there's many other different names for them, but just looking at this site today, you can see that there seemed to be knowledge of the ability of advanced logistics. And of course, these will be attributed to these early civilizations, which may have existed because, as you recall on this channel, we never discard the official historical account, but we question it. And that's what we're doing today with South America. We are questioning this official historical account, because we can see that there are many examples of these structures and these early civilizations and their incredible achievements that cannot be denied. You can go and walk them to this very day in various locations across South America, whether you're in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia. There's examples of this all across the land there. And there's also many lost examples when we consider landscapes such as the Amazon rainforest. And we looked at the fact that there were many attempts to explore this particular area with varying degrees of difficulty over time. And we looked at the account of the search for the lost city of Z by British explorer Percy Fawcett. Looking at these ruins, though, we definitely have the idea that there was no doubt a great civilization. Did it really happen so long ago as we're informed? Or could it be possible that the ruins of this civilization are a little more recent than we might be led to believe? And even looking at the landscape of the Amazon rainforest, where the forest has been cleared, you can see the remnants of geoglyphs within the terrain. How exactly does this make any sense if this has always been a rainforest? Why would anybody bother making such precise geoglyphs in the terrain if it was concealed by the forest? There's even many artifacts and remnants of the Musica civilization. And what exactly does this allude to? Is this again another civilization? Or does it give us the impression that maybe this was all the same civilization, and they had achieved advanced levels that we can only dream of? Again, always looking at the early maps and drawings and depictions, and whether you want to say they're done by artists or cartographers, they allude to many different possibilities to what may have really been in the distant, or perhaps the not-so-distant past. And these are some of the most alluring aspects of this exploration of South America. You look at South America today, and according to the official historical account, it was primarily settled by the Portuguese and the Spanish, and indeed there was the early treaty that broke down who had rights to what lands. And of course this discarded the civilization that was already there, officially the Incans and many others. And over time this was under both the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. And finally, the nations of South America broke off, much in the same way that they did in North America, albeit a little later according to the official historical account, but only a few decades. And there seems to be the mirroring, if you will, of historical events. There are very similar events that occurred, although many more nations came about in South America officially. Nations that established their independence and to this day exist, according to the official historical account, after breaking away from the exploration kingdoms that had originally founded them. Now, what's the real story behind this encounter, these great explorers behind these Portuguese navigators, these Spanish conquerors or conquistadors, and the civilizations that they encountered? Well, we can take the historical account at face value, or we can question it, because there do seem to be some elements about it, and whether we're talking about Cortez or Pizarro or whoever of the conquistadors and the particular empires that they encountered, how is it possible that they managed to achieve these conquests, given all the challenges that they faced? Of course, there's never an issue with logistics whenever we consider the historical account, and oftentimes you're better off not thinking about logistics critically, to say nothing about any of the other challenges that you see. Yet when we go across South America to this day, we can see the results of beautiful cities that go across varied terrain, and achievements and incredible, wondrous infrastructure that seems to have been established in a distant past time, when, much like with all the other areas we've explored, would be very difficult with the technology that was available, and yet it was achieved. We begin by looking at the legacy of Colombia, and we start with Colombia because we're informed that it's where the very first settlement of South America was established during this age of exploration, as they call it, or age of discovery, names that we go back and forth on. And here you can see where many of the original civilizations existed, and they seem to have very defined geographical boundaries. Perhaps Balboa here was the one who actually mapped out these civilizations in his spare time. And I'm sure that the plate armor that he's wearing here did not weigh anything more than 35 pounds. In fact, that helmet probably weighed less than 1.5 pounds. Whatever the accounts, there is also the question of navigating around Cape Horn, or the southern portion of the continent. As we stated earlier, that's the only real way that they had to access the Pacific Ocean. And we're informed by such visionaries as Alistair Cook, the host of Masterpiece Theater, that it was the pursuit of spices that invoked the age of exploration. And here we have the great Venezuelan statesman and military officer Simón Bolívar. He's really the Latin America version of George Washington, or you could say that George Washington is the North American version of him. He was the individual who led the eventual independence of several nations that currently exist in South America, and he's a cultural icon. There are many pictures and depictions of him across the land, and there's no doubt that someone like him existed, although what are the exact details we certainly don't know. Of course, in the depictions, they make it very clear that this is someone in the manner of George Washington, who existed and led inspiring battles and resistance, and is a very colorful and conflicted character in and of themselves. And I certainly don't want to make the impression that there's any sort of derogatory information concerning Simón Bolívar. I always found it intriguing that there were several Americans, or excuse me, when we say Americans, we should be more specific, several North Americans or United States military officers who were named after Simón Bolívar. One even serving in the Civil War, and then his grandson serving in World War II, tragically dying in the Battle of Okinawa while commanding 10th Army. The early inception, though, of the South American nations, from Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and eventually the breakaway of Panama, which we did explore when we explored the Panama Canal, their incipience is quite similar in depiction and statement to the way that the United States broke away from the United Kingdom. And here when we look in the square, Bolivar Square of Bogota, we can see the combination of old world buildings along with newer structures. And it looks quite similar to many things that we've seen in other areas of the land that we've looked at, whether we're in any of the great cities of Europe or even the cities in the United States. And going to the connection of Colombia or Columbia, as in the United States we have the character of Columbia, which represents some sort of divine being, and oddly enough here in this women's suffrage movement, this image taken from Washington, D.C., we have a German actor portraying Colombia or Columbia here in the United States. So what's the connection? And indeed, there's even references that Colombia, or Colombia, was the original name for South America. Is there a connection? Or is it all just another great coincidence? The settlement and exploration of South America, according to the official history, was rife with violence and many different wars, many which seem to be forgotten even though they are well documented by history to this day. For example, ask how many people you come across if they're familiar with the conflict known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, a conflict that broke out between Spain and Great Britain at the time, apparently over a British ship captain whose ear was taken when his ship was searched by Spanish authorities. This even led to George Anson, a British admiral's voyage around the world while conducting this conflict. Yes, this particular commander took 8 ships around the entire world to raid Spanish possessions in this War of Jenkins' Ear. And while he went off with 8 ships and made it all the way around the world, he eventually only returned with 1 ship, and enduring extreme losses amongst his crew. But for this achievement of going around the world, he was considered a great hero, and indeed he rose to the admiralty in the British Navy. And here we even have this drawings showing his ships going through Magellan Straits. Although when you look at the official military effectiveness of this voyage, it's questionable, although it's stated to have been very successful. It seems as though the great success of George Anson was the fact that he made the circumnavigation. And what exactly does this have to do with South America? Well, this shows the strategic importance of South America. And it should also be noted that this was a situation in which the Spanish managed to effectively defend their colonial possessions from Great Britain. Although it doesn't stop the fact that there are mythical heroes or realistic historical heroes such as George Anson. As you can see, they have plaques and memorialize him as a hero, Admiral of the Fleet and Vice Admiral of England. He was First Lord of the Admiralty during the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War is also interesting, as we state that to be World War Zero on this channel. And so many of the connections and what could really be happening. What was the actual time frame? And here we have this later image of George Anson, and it seems as though he's enjoyed his position of being Lord of the Admiralty. Interestingly enough, he doesn't seem to prefer having his hand in his coat, so maybe he just liked to be a little bit more comfortable when he posed for his pictures. Or maybe there's another account that we're not considering. We look at many of the early depictions, though, of the so-called Americas, North and South America or the New World. And in many of the early maps, we see that there are little side cutouts that give us the impression that many of these settlements were very well built up already in the 16 to the 1700s. It gives us the impression that they were able to achieve great logistical wonders when it came to establishing what were informed are fortifications. And yes, if you take the historical account at face value, one would need fortifications to defend their so-called colonial possessions. But I'm always amazed at how precise and how detailed a lot of these colonial possessions in these early settlements were. And I was also amazed at the fact that even though these European navigators, whether they were Spanish, Portuguese, British, or French, or whatever, they always seemed to have no challenges with laying out the baseline of their settlements. And that tends to be what we see when we look closer at Bogota in Colombia. We see many of the same wondrous structures that we've seen elsewhere across the land. Many of these early structures are attributed to the 16 and the 1700s. And while we're just doing an initial overview here, we can already get the impression of fine geometric precision in the construction of these wonderful structures. There's also the fact that if these structures really are hundreds of years old, as the historical account informs us, they are still standing, and they are still used to this day. And whether they're used as schools, municipal buildings, or any of the other many uses that we have for these old structures that endure to this day, it's a testament to the fact that it appears that in the distant past we really could build structures that last to this day. And if this indeed was our civilization that did this, as the historical account informs us, then it appears that we have lost many abilities. Now, of course, we can debate what the reason for this is. We prefer to be more cost-effective. We embrace some sort of economic ideology that precludes us from constructing structures like this today. And maybe that's acceptable to you, and that's how you defend the current historical account. And I certainly don't hold any ill will towards you. You are welcome to think that. But I'm amazed at the fact that we see these structures across Bogota and Colombia, much as we've seen in many other cities, whether we've looked at Europe, the United States, or even in parts of Asia. And here Bogota even has their own train station, which rivals many of the great train stations that we've looked at across the United States and across many places in Europe. And of course there they think to put the dates on it as well. There's even the fact that there's churches that have been repurposed into museums. And much like we saw in Italy, they have the habit of hanging on those nice little advertising flyers on their old structures. That's just what we do in the modern civilization, the modern age. An impressive tower on this particular structure, what used to be a church. And yet, looking in these other structures, we see the many spires and so many arches and domes that oftentimes reflect, is this really the civilization that constructed these? Or was there an earlier civilization? Was there a different knowledge of construction and logistics that tends to supersede what we believe or what we've been informed of what the actual construction account of these structures really are? Because to say that there are conflicting accounts, and by conflicting accounts, just simply asking critical questions about how were these structures pulled off when there was limitations in logistics. There wasn't a developed road system. And yet you can also find the museum in Bogota, which contains many artifacts that alludes to earlier civilizations, and we saw that map at the start of this particular section that showed us the name of these earlier civilizations, including apparently their very defined geographical boundaries. Looking at some of these artifacts, though, you'll see some very puzzling depictions of different figures. Were these really from these earlier civilizations? What exactly do these figures represent? And of course, historians and archaeologists will tell us that they know exactly what these figures represented, even though they were never present when these civilizations existed. They didn't need to be. They're that intelligent, and there's many other well-documented records, although it's rather intriguing when you consider that pretty much any of the history of South or Central America before the Age of Discovery is considered the pre-Columbian era, not the pre-Columbian era. Yes, another interesting overlap of terms. And what exactly is this figure showing here? This is very intriguing, as though the chest is burst open and something has come out of the chest. I'm really going to have to get on the ground in Bogota and visit this museum again, because I have the distinct impression there are many interesting figures. Speaking of, are these the creatures that actually burst out of the chest, or is this representing something else? And I know what you're saying, really, you need to stop watching so much science fiction, and you're probably correct. But yet, looking around at the other figures and artifacts, it does paint to an entirely different indication of civilizations that exceed our expectations, especially when you open your mind about what the historical account could truly be. Do these figures represent some sort of parasite, or do they represent some sort of divine being? Is it telling us some other sort of story that doesn't really make a lot of sense? And focusing on this gives us the impression that there are different ideas behind what the civilization really could have represented. Because if we don't ask these questions, then we'll simply accept whatever it is that we're informed about this particular civilization. We really won't challenge what it is that we understand it to be. And moving on, what exactly is this figure supposed to represent? Is this supposed to be another sort of divine being? Is this supposed to be some sort of high priest? Again, my mind defaults back to the science fiction origin, and I'm thinking that it reminds me of one of the Time Lord costumes from Doctor Who. I'm sure, again, that's just a coincidence. And now we turn our attention to Montserrat Sanctuary, 1650 to 1657, built on Montserrat Hill overlooking Bogota at 10,000 feet elevation. A very impressive religious sanctuary. Imagine them constructing this in the 1600s. Look at some of the detailing behind this architectural achievement. Why exactly would anybody want to go through the difficulty of constructing something like this at such an elevation at a time when Bogota was still, according to official history, a new city? And yet somehow someone managed to pull off building this structure. Of course, someone will say, well, it's there, and history tells us that it was completed, so it must have happened just as we're informed. And that may be so. But when we look at some of the details behind the sanctuary, we can see that once again we have this impression of a structure that was built on top of an earlier structure. And it seems that whenever we have these very high elevation structures, or at least structures that are achieved at high elevations, there usually is stated to be a religious reason, and no doubt this structure is no different. But looking on the inside of the sanctuary, we again see the fine geometric precision. So consider this. Consider the difficulties and the logistical challenges that the official historical account expects us to accept. And we are to accept it. And it may well be that the structure was built in some fashion, or perhaps modified, or dare I say even renovated, in the time frame that we're informed. But it all seems to be very questionable, especially when you look in some of the detailing behind the stairways and the foundations. There's also the very dramatic views of this sanctuary overlooking the city of Bogota, the capital of Colombia. It's a very impressive achievement, and at any point in time, even if that was done today, it would be considered a very impressive achievement. Of course, for some unknown reason, we don't have the many wealthy individuals that we have in our civilization that are attempting to build structures such as this. And you can see the main means of accessing this sanctuary given its current location. Now, are we to believe that they had a similar structure and a similar infrastructure available for accessing such an area in the 1600s? No, of course not, because that was beyond the technological capacity at that time. But building a structure like this was not beyond the technological capacity at the time. And when exactly did these means of transportation actually come about? When were they originally imposed? Because if they did have something like this available that was already functional, or perhaps with a little bit of repair became functional, then suddenly the ability to renovate such a structure becomes a little bit more palatable. But what's the real story behind it? Well, we can take the official historical account at face value and not question this dramatic structure. Or we can question it and come up with other means, other ideas for how it would have been achieved. And indeed, I think of all the other sweeping areas that we've been to where we have vast changes in elevation, and we ask these questions about how these structures, whether it's a great cathedral or some other basilica, as many tend to be, or even the retaining walls that tend to be constructed. The great hill or mountain of Montserrat, yes, I probably shouldn't say hill, is named after this impressive terrain feature in Catalonia, an autonomous region in Spain. We'll be doing our own little exploration of this particularly interesting region, and I'm sure that this is a natural terrain feature, and it may well be. And now we look at the Metropolitan Cathedral Basilica of Bogota and Primate of Colombia. Rolls right off the tongue. 1807 to 1823. And it should be noted that this is the fourth particular structure. Yes, another one of these accounts that we have of these incredible religious buildings, in which case they've had to build multiple incarnations of it. And yet, whenever this structure actually was constructed, it is still dramatic and still very impressive to this day. And indeed, we do see similar structures in places such as Mexico City and in other areas that we've explored. And perhaps we'd be willing to believe that they were able to construct structures just as they did in Europe. But again, there's logistical challenges, there's a limitation of population, and there's all other kinds of challenges that you would simply have to ignore to believe that these structures were constructed in the way that we were told. And why would there be an account of 4 different structures? And strangely enough, it's the similar story that we have in Europe. There are multiple religious edifices that are constructed in the exact same area. So I guess there's no trouble with building on top of the original foundations. And of course, this particular basilica is no exception, featuring a very incredible organ. And once again, an organ that might define something else. And then we have the National Sanctuary of Our Lady of Carmen, constructed 1926 and 1938. A little bit more of a recent structure. And yet it does seem to reflect some of the things that we saw recently when we looked at buildings in Italy and some of the basilicas and cathedrals there, especially with the same striping construction. Of course, the official historical account accounts for this by telling us that this was done by an Italian architect, much in the same way that the Kremlin apparently was designed by an Italian architect back when the Kremlin was originally designed. Yes. It's always the same story. Travel was easy back in the day. Although, this seems to be a little bit more credible, and I have no issue with looking at structures like this. Is it possible that our civilization pulled off this very impressive edifice? It's possible. But yet when we look at the details, we see the same conflicting accounts. We see the statues that seem to be a little bit different than what we see in the actual edifice itself. We see the coloring and detailing that went into this structure. And we have to ask the question, could we build this structure today? Could anybody build this structure today? And the main difference is, while there are accounts that there are individual efforts that may be happening across the land, there's certainly not the simultaneous construction all across the land of all these structures at the same time. Although these accounts tend to be peppered with different accounts of these structures sometimes taking a couple years to a period of hundreds of years, depending on the size and eminence of the particular cathedral or whatever structure we're talking about. So once again, we look at this and we see the same examples that we've seen elsewhere. The same symbols that are supposedly religious in origin, and yet sometimes they tend to defy our expectations when we look at this structure. And for whatever reason, we do have different remnants of a previous civilization that do seem present, whether we're looking in Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, or any of the other nations of South America. Of course, the background and the account could explain it all, but there are other details that we have to consider. And just looking at these palaces, these cathedrals, and these other edifices, we can find that there are dramatic examples. And whether you're focusing on some of the windows that even have their own decorations, or some of the very impressive spiral pillars that are purely for decoration, or even the foundation stones that you see in this particular edifice, these are the questions you have to ask to really try to come to the conclusions in terms of this particular structure. And again, looking on the interior, we see the same geometric precision, and we see the coloring that we have on the exterior. I would really appreciate actually seeing a fully detailed and chronological account of the construction of this structure from start to finish. And from there we go to Machu Picchu, and now we're back in Peru. Machu Picchu being a remnant of an Incan civilization, or the Incan civilization, one of their primary cities. And you can see here in the imagery that it's in a very, very isolated location in the mountains that one would expect to be very difficult to reach. And we're informed that the Incans had very advanced construction techniques, and they did have a developed logistics system. Of course, no motorization or mechanization, but they did have roads apparently. And it seems that even in the highest mountains there appear to be signs of artificial construction. Or perhaps it's just my mind playing tricks on me. What do you think about this particular image? Machu Picchu has been featured in many different explorations, and it's covered by many other explorers, both mainstream historical explorers and alternative explorers. It does seem to give the indication that there was a much more advanced knowledge in previous civilizations, and here we have an officially recognized previous civilization, the Incans. And maybe they did exist exactly as we're informed, but once again I'm quite surprised at all the detailed knowledge that we have of their means and their ways and their very society, even though the direct lineage seems to have been broken up by the unfortunate official efforts of the conquistadors, and this little policy called the encomienda, which is what the Spanish and the Portuguese applied in various formats across South and Central America. Yet you also get the impression of more wondrous structures in this particular area of Machu Picchu. Larger structures that seem to be beyond the capacity of someone to easily construct. And again, we have to ask the question, how exactly was this originally constructed in this very remote location? And why was this settlement, this city, or whatever it originally was, constructed in this remote location? Was this to survive some sort of calamity or some sort of event that people were concerned of? Or is there a completely different explanation behind it? I was always impressed at just how fine all the stones seemed to fit together, like a very elaborate and complex puzzle. And yet even Machu Picchu has many different conflicting accounts with it, because in many of the original images and statements we have, Machu Picchu was covered by the surrounding foliage. It was overgrown, and it had to be cleared out. And so of course that involves a renovation. We're informed that these large steps that we see here was a form of terracing, done to enable farming, and that may be so. Or could it have had a very different purpose? Is it merely an attempt to explain an architectural achievement that doesn't really make a lot of sense? And recall that it's not all fine stones that someone could have moved with their hands. We see images such as this. Are we to really believe that thousands of individuals spent their time carving this in the remote mountains in the distant past with the limitations that they had? Some of the images that we have do give us clues about how overgrown this site particularly was when it was initially discovered. But is there a different account behind it? Have there been modifications made to this site beyond what we truly understand? And why is it that this continues to be a very dramatic and alluring site to this day? And regardless of which side of the interpretation of history you tend to be on, this gains the attention of many explorers because it is very dramatic. And it's not something that you can easily just explain away and say, well, it was well documented that this civilization, the Incans, did A, B, C, and D, and they were able to overcome their logistical difficulties to build in the high elevation. Of course, we don't see any cable cars that give them easy access up here, so who knows? And here in this image you can see how overgrown and how much natural foliage there was over Machu Picchu. But what's the issue with this image? Is this what it really looked like? Or is there something else going on? And what sort of modifications were made to this? It should also be noted that the film Secret of the Incas was filmed in Machu Picchu, starring Charlton Heston. Yes, his costume in this particular film was the inspiration for Indiana Jones as portrayed by Harrison Ford. For some reason, the filmmakers didn't acknowledge it. They even fly through the airport of Cusco, where they have this obelisk, and if you watch the film, which you can, Secret of the Incas, you can actually see what this airport looked like in the past when they filmed it in the early 1950s. And of course, yes, the inspiration for Indiana Jones. And we'll close our exploration by looking at Buenos Aires in Argentina. Buenos Aires, a very impressive city, and yet a modern city at the same time. And here we're at the distant southern latitudes, and we do see the signs of modernity in Buenos Aires. But when you look a little closer, you'll find that there are some very dramatic remnants of what we would consider to be Old World architecture. In fact, there are many dramatic remnants. When we look at earlier depictions of Buenos Aires from the 1600s, we're informed that it was originally settled in the late 1500s, we already get the impression that it was well built out. And even a subsequent image in the 1800s, you could even say that the skyline in some ways rivals the skyline that we would have for the mighty New York City in the 1800s. And this has always been a very impressive city, and when we look a little closer at some of these structures here in the distant horizon, we have no shortage of impressive domes and spires, and once again alluding to the fact that this was always a built-out city. Many of these dramatic structures exist to this day, and we'll be doing a detailed and focused exploration, examining many of these structures in Buenos Aires to this day, and looking at their historical account and evaluating what we're told about them. Just looking at them now, though, we can get the idea that they are very impressive and dramatic, and there are images of what they appeared like in the distant past. And again, these images are very peculiar and similar to what we have in the images in the past. They did build their own obelisk in Buenos Aires in the 1930s that we're informed, and unlike the Washington Monument, it does appear to be of one unified color. There's many other structures, though, that give the impression of a different architectural background for Buenos Aires. And it should be noted that this was a city that was selected for filming several scenes for the film Highlander 2. And yet, looking at other images, we get the impression that there was a great opulence to this city and that it's always been present. And again, it's the same dramatic opulence and detailing that we've had in many of the cities that we've looked at in other areas of the land. And even in these older images, we see this striking architectural example, this detailing that was pulled off when logistics were at a much more limited capacity than they are today. And Buenos Aires should be complimented on the fact that they do have many of these structures that still exist to this day. Somehow they managed to survive all the phases of urban renewal that were so prominent in the 1900s across the land. Even looking closely at some of the smaller neighborhoods, you can see the examples of old world architecture that continued to persist. And this is no doubt a city that's high on my list of an on-site exploration, because I would certainly like to compare and contrast how the old world architecture in Buenos Aires compares to many of the newer structures that they've erected over time. And indeed, we have some of the most famous structures that we've looked at. There's also the National Palace, and there's many monuments that, oddly enough, reflect the monuments that we've seen elsewhere across the land. there are many details that seem to be present. And indeed, looking in some of the other smaller neighborhoods, you can see you have portal windows, you have balconies, and you have no shortage of arches. And so it seems that there are many signs of the old world, the original architecture, that are present in the details of Buenos Aires. And that alone makes this a very impressive city, and something that I think we could spend many days or weeks just exploring every single structure and example of structures that endure. Looking at this particular corner building with these domes and these spires, and again seeing the combination of what we would consider to be, or what we're informed is, neoclassical architecture. Such as here with this cathedral in Buenos Aires. Yes, another cathedral. Yet, oddly enough, there seem to be signs of a different civilization present, because if this is supposed to represent the Roman Catholic Church, or any of the other churches for that matter, how exactly do we reconcile that with what we understand? Looking at the dome, we have a different sign of other civilizations. But there's a little cross on top with the spire, so that should clear up any of your questions. Yet when you look at the front of it, you see figures that don't exactly seem to communicate the figures that we'd expect to see. But again, perhaps that's just my mind playing tricks on me, and maybe there's another entire account with it. We do have early paintings of this cathedral from the early 1800s that should clear up any questions that we have. Interestingly enough, though, none of the figures are appearing above the impressive columns that we have within the pediment. And yet, looking in the interior, again, we see the example of very advanced and artistic architecture. Now, once again, someone will try to say, if you assess something as artistic, that is not necessarily proof of an earlier civilization. Well, actually it is, because when you have a civilization that is very clearly focused on artistic importance, then that gives you a different focus than what our current civilization is focused on, which of course we're told is brutal utility. The Palace of the Argentine National Congress, constructed 1897 to 1906. And if I were someone who were born in Argentina and I actually came across this structure, this would definitely be building number one for me in my old world explorations. And yet we can see in the early images that we have of its construction, there seemed to be an entirely different color scheme behind it. And naturally we have a construction photo that shows the main edifice already being complete. And then we have this other interesting photo that reminds me of many of the photos that we have of the Iowa State Capitol in the early 1900s that look very similar to this structure. This is very impressive though when we look on the inside, and we again see the same architectural styling, such as the pediments above every single door and all the detailing that went into this. Now, once again, perhaps we could explain this by saying that the good people of Argentina were inspired by the accounts of all the wondrous state capitals that they were constructing across the United States in the 1800s, and therefore they wanted to build their own impressive edifice with a very unique dome on top of it. And maybe that is the official historical account. Or perhaps there's an entirely different official historical account behind this very impressive palace. And I do say that a palace is quite an appropriate title for a structure as wondrous as this. Here's one of the early construction images that we have, and I'm rather stricken by the fact that, as usual, we have a lack of workers present, and we seem to have a lot of advertising going on. Very fascinating. Yet looking on the inside of the dome, we can see that it compares to all the incredible and beautiful domes that we've looked at the state capitals across the United States. Oddly enough, we have similar symbols as well. So again, we could just say that they were inspired or that they used the same architectural information. One thing that always struck me though about all these structures being completed across both North, South America, and even in Europe in the late 1800s is the fact that not only were they all these architects available who could do this, but there were all the contractors and people who, actually constructed these edifices that could build them. Well, you know what they say, just call E. Townsend Mix and he could be anywhere that you need. This looks awfully familiar. Once again, we see this cartouche device, as I like to call it. And there's a little bit of a lion's head above it. What exactly is this representing? And so this is another structure that we're definitely going to have to explore on site and in person. And I'm certainly looking forward to comparing that with some of our observations and earlier explorations that we've had of some of the palaces, as we call them, within the United States or the state capitals. Looking at some of these images, though, we have very dramatic and incredible architectural achievements here in Buenos Aires. And thus we'll begin our explorations of South America, looking at the cities, looking at the signs of the earlier civilization. But what are your thoughts? Are these the achievements of these nations, or are they the achievements of earlier civilizations? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me. Greetings, channel members, and once again we're taking a look at another interesting film that you may have heard of if you hung out in the video store a little bit back in the 1980s, and you more than likely have not heard of. Galaxy of Terror. On the surface, this is a 1981 American science fiction horror film directed by Bruce D. Clark and produced by legendary, infamous producer Roger Corman through New World Pictures. It stars Edward Albert, Aaron Moran, Ray Walston, and a slew of others, including future horror film stars Sid Haig and Robert Englund. You might better know him as Freddy Krueger. And it also stars a very, very interesting and quite intriguing performer who plays Captain Tranter, and that being Grace Zabriskie. Now, if you're familiar with my affinity for David Lynch films, you'll know that Grace Zabriskie is, well, a tentpole in many of the David Lynch films and TV series. She also appeared in Child's Play 2. She has a connection with what we're going to be talking about in our live stream later this week. Now, depending on one's perspective or whose account you believe, she either had a 10-year-long connection or a 4.5-minute-long connection with what we're going to be talking about. Yes, I'm quite serious. But back to the topic at hand. Why are we discussing Galaxy of Terror? What is unique about this film? First question, is it even a good film? I'm an American science fiction horror film, Aurelian, you wouldn't recommend a bad film. Well, overall as a film, I would probably give it about a midway rating. Yes, I will admit that from my own perception, standards of the early 80s are a lot higher. Now, you may be aware that Roger Corman was responsible for another sci-fi film that came out a little bit before this, Battle Beyond the Stars. This was, of course, during the quote-unquote Star Wars craze because Star Wars invented science fiction films. Well, at least that's what you'd be believing back in the early 1980s. Now, we know unequivocally that's not true, but that was the perception. And certainly with what film studios were doing and producers like Roger Corman, it definitely reinforced that perspective. But this film is set in a dystopian future where humanity is a spacefaring race ruled by a sole person called the Master. Actually, the Planet Master. The film features a space crew confronting primal fears after they are marooned on a distant planet. Now, what's interesting is how a lot of people who review this film or write reviews on it don't seem to fully grasp or understand it. Now, it's a hard-hitting, fast film. It's only 81 minutes long. And this particular film is not necessarily compared to Star Wars. It's more comparable in the mind of people to Alien at that time, the original Alien. Yes, the franchise that we're still trying to put out in different permutations, still trying to develop a lore, even though it really wasn't supposed to have a lore. Now, there was the first film, and there was the great hard-hitting sequel, directed by James Cameron, who, by the way, got his start working on this particular film and the earlier Battle Beyond the Stars under Roger Corman. In fact, James Cameron was one of the individuals who came up with many innovative techniques of filming on a very limited budget. You may say that this film had a budget of $1.8 million. Now, granted, even adjusting for inflation, hell, even making a film for $10 million now is basically unheard of after inflation. But in any event, this was a profitable film, and it did endure at the video stores for quite some time. And I'll admit, even as far as the mid-1990s, it was quite a popular rental. Might have had something to do with the poster, I don't know. And on that note, here is the poster. Hell has just been relocated. Galaxy of Terror. And you have a poster that looks like it's something out of either the 1970s gore novels or something along those lines. And this particular article, written by Daniel Robichaud, if I'm pronouncing that properly, only a year ago or so. And let's see what Daniel has to say about this film. A team of astronauts has been assembled by a strange being with a red fireball for a head known only as the Master. So again, missing it's the Planet Master, but whatever, and dispatched on a rescue mission. 7 members of a previous exploratory expedition have gone radio silent and may require help. Commanded by the able, but too old for this nonsense, Ilvar, and piloted by the suicidal Captain Tranter, Grace Zabriskie. I'm just going to say that if you actually go through watching this film, and yes, it is available on YouTube with ads, it is free to watch though. It's also available on Amazon for Prime members. Grace Zabriskie's performance in the character of Captain Tranter is very intriguing and very interesting. Now, in this little write-up here, it doesn't say why Captain Tranter is suicidal. Keep in mind, this is only an 80-minute long film. Yet, you have to pay attention because the background is there. The fact that Captain Tranter was involved in a massacre. The Hesperus massacre, as it were, the only survivor. And as a result of this, Captain Tranter is suffering what today we have labeled as post-traumatic stress disorder. And the performance that Grace Zabriskie gives, and if you've ever seen Grace Zabriskie, she's definitely tailor-made for David Lynch performances. She's a very unique performer. She has a very wide range of acting. Not something that we see as much these days. I'm not saying that our current generation of actors are terrible, just that it seemed to be something that you would see a little bit more. And like I said, Grace Zabriskie herself has quite an intriguing background and an involvement with the movement of Discordia that we're going to be looking at later in this week. So a lot of coincidences here. And this film is actually full of references. This film is actually an entire old world story that plays out and is a warning, but it's beyond a lot of people because they just see the comparison with other science fiction films, naturally. And what this little rescue mission finds is a hostile planet, a wrecked facility, and numerous homicidal creatures. So I could see if you just take it on face value, it would seem like, yes, this is just another alien sort of film, isn't it? Before they can even locate all 7 of the presumed dead members of the former expedition, they're being picked off by those terrors. Does an ancient artifact, a massive pyramid of unknown origin or purpose, hold the secrets for their survival, or is the key really locked inside their own minds? Bruce D. Clark co-writes and directs a wonky slice of intergalactic horror. Now, it talks about Roger Corman Productions and some of the other ones, and then he goes on to talk about, sadly, the story here is pretty much nonsensical. Well, really, it's not, but you have to pay close attention because, like I said, the film is only 80 minutes long, but there are individual lines that spell out the background. Ray Walston's character actually says everything that's going on in about 3 sentences towards the end, but does explain exactly what's been happening and why it's been happening. And indeed, the very end of the film is actually an allusion to one of the most terrifying realities that may have been faced in the old world. The script uses the thinnest possible means to string together a series of gruesome set pieces in which incredibly thin characters. And you see, I don't agree with these assessments. I mean, it's interesting that people go out of the way to go belittling this movie. I mean, Captain Tranter, wonderfully named character, I might add, has a background, and despite only being in the film for about half of the runtime, give or take, 40 minutes or more, is a more interesting character than any of the non-existent background characters that we have in virtually all the Star Wars films from the prequels onward. That's just my opinion. Maybe you'll watch this movie if you decide to, and you'll think that this guy was absolutely correct when he wrote this. When faced with a mix of puppets, FX makeup, and stop-motion animated horrors. Until the final 5 or 10 minutes of the thing, none of the creatures really gets a second use. So there are a plethora of alien creatures to be found. It's a wealth of weirdness. Still, the number of effects setups, the creativity that goes into some of the alien creatures, and the general atmosphere of the nightmarishness is effective. And when you watch this film, not only will you compare it to Alien, you'll probably naturally compare it to Event Horizon and other films that came out later. What really influenced what, though? Well, that's a question. Oh, he even calls out Grace Zabriskie here. For example, the always enjoyable and quirky Grace Zabriskie, good way to describe her, by the way, plays a character who is the lone survivor of a tragedy called only the Hesperus. It's called the Hesperus disaster, but whatever, a massacre, which itself is a nod to a famous ship disaster commemorated in the moving Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, The Wreck of the Hesperus. By the way, if you want another old world reference, read that poem. Read it and understand exactly what it's saying and what it's alluding to. It's not exactly what meets the eye, much like this film isn't, but what can you expect? Whenever that particular name is mentioned around her, Captain Tranter spaces out and whispers something cryptic and vaguely unsettling. Actually, you can tell exactly what she's saying, just watch carefully and listen. But, I'm not wondering if we're seeing a difficult attention span. I realize 80 minutes is a long time to hold an attention span, especially in 2024. Never mind. The performance is fine, enjoyable even. The sudden cut to her spacing out, accompanied by creepy music, which then immediately turns off when we cut back to the group shot of whoever she's talking to, well, that makes what could have been an eerie foreshadow of psychological instability into an utterly ludicrous moment. Yes, it's probably fair to call out certain moments of this film. Like I said, this is not the perfectly made film. But what's intriguing to me is how people tend to get it wrong. And they tend to get the plot completely wrong. I mean, it's very clear to understand what's going on, but then you want to call out that it's not spelled out what's going on, just so long as you listen to a single line, but then he demonstrates awareness of that line. So it's really, really, really intriguing. And not to spoil it for you, but we actually find out who the Planet Master really is and what the Planet Master actually is. And it's not really a human being, it's some kind of ethereal being, which is what really makes the implications of this story very terrifying. Now, whether this movie is any good or not on its own merits, that's ultimately up to you to decide. I will say that as a complete film, it has some great strengths. The performances are wonderful. And a lot of the technical aspects of the film are incredible, especially given the virtually non existent budget, which is what Roger Corman was known for. Look, this guy could get films out the gate. Some of them are well remembered, but perhaps what Roger Corman is best remembered for is all the other Hollywood careers that started through him. Is this a coincidence or is it not? Such as the aforementioned James Cameron. Now, in the 80s and the early 90s, James Cameron was the go to guy. Then we got Titanic, and that seemed to put a big, huge stop on everything. And, the less said about Avatar, the better. No, I'm not a fan of the 3D gimmick, just between us, because that's all it is. It's a gimmick. And there's really nothing in Avatar, in my humble opinion, that stands alone, or is unique, or revolutionary, or referring to anything. It's merely somebody putting together a bunch of different plot ideas, utilizing a 3D gimmick with special effects, and then trying to tell a less than sufficient story. They did it much better in Dances with Wolves and Fern Gully. That's just my opinion. Again, make of it what you will. If you enjoy Avatar and its numerous sequels that have been promised and are slowly coming, then all the more power to you. I'm just sharing my opinion with you. It was the second Corman film on which Cameron worked as a crewman, first being Battle Beyond the Stars. Yeah, that features Richard Thomas, better known as John Boy from the Waltons, as the protagonist. He actually does a pretty commendable job in the film. Working on a tight budget, Cameron's innovative filmmaking techniques came to the forefront. In one scene, he was able to figure out a way to get maggots to wiggle on cue by developing a metal plate on which the maggots were placed, then ran an electric current through the plate whenever filming began, causing the maggots to move energetically about. His ability to find low-tech solutions to such problems reportedly made him a favorite of Corman and eventually allowed him to pursue more ambitious projects. And, it seems that his ambition went unlimited. We're going to build the entire Titanic. I know I'm just speaking with hyperbole, but still, hyperbole and James Cameron go together quite well, don't they? Ridley Scott's Alien was an important inspiration for Galaxy of Terror, but I will say it was an inspiration because Galaxy of Terror, the plot, the setup, the resolution, it's completely different from Alien. You might be surprised to know that there's not a single xenomorph in Galaxy of Terror. Everything comes at you. Now, you can see here with the worm scene, it should be noted that there are some borderline, if not outright, things that may be considered very inappropriate about the film, depending again on your perspective. So by all means, read through the synopsis. If it's something you don't want to watch, you don't have to watch to understand what we're going to be talking about later in the week. You can certainly look into the background and the biography of performer Grace Zabriskie and understand her connections to what we are going to be talking about. And then you can also read the synopsis here about the film and come to the conclusion about what's really being said with the identity of the aforementioned Planet Master, who is just referred to as the Master. What exactly is that referring to? What's the film really about? And of course, they talk about all the controversy with what needed to be in the film, what wasn't in the film, and then, of course, trying to preclude that terrifying X rating, something they also had to do with RoboCop in 1987, specifically enough. But why am I highlighting Galaxy of Terror? It does actually show a true old world story and the warning of one of the worst things that could happen from the old world. And in fact, if you listen carefully to Ray Walston's character, You might remember him as Boothby from Star Trek Next Generation, the gardener who called out Picard on what happened to his hair. And then we'll just forget that scene of Picard being completely bald when he was a cadet, Star Trek Nemesis, along with the rest of that film. Again, just my opinion. But anyway, same guy, same actor. You'll recognize him. He's been in so many things. Passed away a little while back, but wonderful performer. The lines of dialogue, though, that he has about what's really going on. And like I said, he explains it in 3 sentences. But it's very intriguing what he's really talking about with the concept of fear, manifesting reality, and the very existence of what the planet master, the entity itself, really is. Yes, I'm throwing out lots of hints here. And one thing before I close out this little exploration. In addition to Cameron, the film is also known for indirectly starting actor Bill Paxton's career. At this time, Paxton was not an actor, but was working as a set decorator. We all start somewhere. His working relation with Cameron would eventually help pull him into the acting arena. You might recall his opening scene in Terminator, at the telescope, at the observatory. Yes, that observatory. We'll be getting to it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this exploration. If you're so inclined, watch Galaxy of Terror. If not, read about it and see what they're really trying to convey and how was it they had this in the synopsis of this film and within the plot. And what were you really seeing when you see the struggle of these characters? Well, thank you for joining me.